kick things off is Kathleen Hamilton. Kathleen is originally English. She lives in Portugal and is a force of nature. Another kind of, if you had to pick how you name yourself, right, and what it is you do, wouldn't it be awesome to say, I am a force of nature? And just that gets me really stoked about her presentation. She's a climate and social justice activist and is going to tell us how to step up rather than shut down in the face of climate collapse. So please welcome to the stage our first speaker, Kathleen Hamilton.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I am Kathleen Hamilton. I'm the Chief Partnerships Officer at Force of Nature, which is a youth nonprofit mobilizing mindsets for climate change. And I am here to talk to you today about climate change. Thanks for making it out. I know it's first session, so probably doing a little bit of waking up if you too were enjoying the gin bar. If you couldn't tell, this session's going to be in English. You can ask me questions in German afterwards, but I won't understand what you're saying. But thank you for making it and being here today with me. So I want to start off with a question. How often do you think about climate change? Before my role at Force of Nature, I was working in tech. I'm now a recovering, jaded tech professional, but I spent 4 years as the head of product at an ed tech firm. And I thought about climate change all the time. So much so that it led me to leave my job because I felt like we weren't doing enough. Now, I'm not here to tell you to leave your job. I think every role has an important part to play in climate action. But the feelings that I was feeling, I want to talk about whether those were a good or a bad thing, and how we can step up instead of shut down in the face of climate change. But first, I want to set the scene with a little bit of data. So, according to the World Health Organization, this year, and in the last few years, there are 3 times as many climate-related weather events as there were in 2014. Now, these weather events are causing 150,000 deaths every year. There was a study done in an Australian university that cited 5 million deaths because of climate change-related temperature extremes in the world. This is some pretty harrowing data for 10:30 in the morning. But it's no surprise that we feel overwhelmed, right? You've probably seen it in the news this year, especially as we've been sitting inside on our phones, from the floods across India, Germany, Europe being absolutely torn apart by heat waves, extreme temperatures causing people to flee their homes, fires across the entirety of the United States. Historically, many of us living in relative climate privilege have been able to avoid the fallout of climate change. We haven't had to live through these disasters. But now, as extremes get worse and worse, we're all experiencing them in some way, right? However, there are still the most affected people in areas in the world who had very little to do with causing climate change due to emissions in the first place, who are living this on the front lines regularly. So, with all of that information, of course we feel overwhelmed. And it's normal to shut off your phone, shut off the news. It's too much information to take in at one time when you're also trying to work, take care of your family, live your life, right? It's a lot going on. There are now 5 times as many news reports on climate change as there were in 2014, every month. I went to the Guardian site, which is the news site I use, and there were 6 articles posted every day under the topic of the climate crisis. There's no way you can take in that much information, right? And actually, I'm not here to convince you that climate change is real. It's very likely that most of you in this room agree. There was a study done by, it was called the People's Climate Vote, and it was released by Oxford University at the beginning of this year. It surveyed 1.2 million people across the world, and 64% of those responded, saying that the climate crisis was an emergency that needed immediate and effective action. So I wanted to tell you a little bit of my story to see how we can understand the emotions that we're feeling around climate change and how we can use them to fuel us instead of freeze us. I grew up learning about climate change. I'm of the generation that learned it from a very young age. There are likely many people in this room that also experienced that. But I went to a very unusual school, one that talked about climate change and sustainability a lot more than most. And that school was the Green School in Bali. We spent every day in these giant bamboo cathedrals with no walls. We learned how to grow our own food. We learned about global issues, critical thinking, current events. We learned how to set up solar panels, how to have renewable energy through a project in the local river where we learned how to set up a hydro dam. We worked with local schools on litter cleanups and education around recycling. We were taught these skills and told, we were taught these skills and we were told that when we went out into the world, it was our responsibility to do something about climate change. This is a big deal, right, to tell kids? But the alumni of the Green School have done just that, many of them. So I want to draw an example of two. You may or may not have heard of them. The Wyson sisters. At 10 and 12 years old, they founded a movement called Bye Bye Plastic Bags. How many of you have visited Bali? A few, right? And when you went to this tropical paradise, the beaches, the beautiful culture, you probably also saw plastic covering the beaches. And you saw trash piles being burnt and families living in the smoke of this trash, right? These sisters saw this. They grew up in Bali. And they decided to start running litter cleanups every week, just outside of their house, eventually on the beach, with other Green School students. This eventually led to years of campaigning, which resulted in the Indonesian government outlawing single-use plastic bags in Bali in 2018. This is just the beginning of a much bigger battle, right? But it started a global movement across the world, just because they decided to do that one thing. Now, the Green School was recognized in the World Economic Forum's Schools of the Future report as a place that was growing the next generation of green leaders, and in many cases, it did just that. It also put a lot of pressure on all the students who went out not knowing what they wanted to change. So when I graduated from the Green School, you can see how I was optimistic, right? I grew up in this world of climate action. I knew that change was possible because I had seen it. And so I went out into the world ready to change it, and so I moved to America. San Francisco, to be precise. And, you know, the city of revolutionaries and dreamers and doers, or so I thought. In the first week of living in San Francisco, this is the first time I'd lived in America, I saw rampant homelessness, people experiencing homelessness on the streets. In front of these huge tech skyscrapers where people were going to work and making hundreds of thousands every year, there was drug use, there were people sleeping rough, and in the first week of living in my dorms, there was a shooting outside my building. 9 people were shot. 1 person died. Suddenly, the problems in the world seemed a lot bigger than anything I could solve. How are you going to go about solving climate change or taking climate action when we can't even solve systemic problems like homelessness? It didn't seem possible, and I started feeling hopeless. All that optimism that I had growing up drained out of me. I stopped reading the news, stopped talking to my friends about climate problems. I even started eating meat again after 7 years as a vegetarian. I now know what this cocktail of emotions is called. I didn't know it then. And to be honest, even knowing it and naming it, I still feel it sometimes. Eco-anxiety, eco-guilt, and imposter syndrome. Eco-anxiety is that feeling you get in the gut when you think about the future with climate change, where you don't know what's coming and it makes you feel anxious. Maybe you have children who have told you they're afraid about their future. That feeling you get, that's eco-anxiety. Eco-guilt is the feeling that you get when you go to the supermarket and you choose an option wrapped in plastic because there weren't any others, and you're just like, oh, I didn't want to do that, right? Guilt that maybe you're not doing enough. For me, despite all of the privilege I felt I had been afforded with the education that I had, I didn't think I could do anything. And it started making me feel incredibly guilty. It shut me down. Imposter syndrome says, who am I to do something anyway? Right? What do I know? There's no way I could do anything meaningful that would actually matter. It's very likely many of us have felt some version of imposter syndrome in our jobs or career. But it relates to this too, right? All of these emotions tell us something. Eco-guilt tells us we wish we could be doing more. Guilt is a really important emotion. It tells us about our moral compass, what we believe is right and wrong. So if you're feeling eco-guilt, it means you want to be doing more, right? If you're feeling eco-anxiety, that's a totally normal response to an existential threat that we don't fully know the extent of, right? If we were afraid of things way back in primitive days, we could just run away from them, right? A bear is coming, you run away. The climate crisis is coming. We don't know what that looks like. Or we do, and we can't go anywhere, right? Imposter syndrome often means that we feel we're not experienced enough, that there's nothing meaningful we can do. This is normal when we're on social media all day, we see experts, you see climate activists, you're like, oh, they're doing great work, but there's no way I could do that. I work in a job in a company that doesn't want to hear about it, right? 70% of young people feel hopeless about the climate crisis. This is from research that we did at Force of Nature that surveyed students around the world. 70%. If you have children, maybe you've heard this. If you have younger family members, if you spend any time on the internet, right? 70% is a huge number. This is a quote from a student who we worked with at Force of Nature that says, "I feel constant anxiety that the climate is seriously worsening, but there seems to be almost nothing you can do about it as an individual, and so many people don't seem to care." One of the biggest drivers of eco-anxiety in young people is the feeling that older generations aren't doing anything. You don't want to hear that, right? And there are things happening, but there could always be more. So with all of these emotions, I went after university and I started working in tech. Why did I go into tech? Because it was optimistic. Many of you may have been drawn into tech for similar reasons. There are so many incredible visions of the future in the tech world. And I actually truly believe that tech has the power to make incredible things happen, to solve problems that previously we haven't had solutions to. There were some amazing talks yesterday on AI and the power of data within the climate crisis, right? And so all of these things are possible, but when I went into tech, what I also saw was companies who were beholden to their shareholders, who didn't want change, they wanted profits. I saw startups with revolutionary ideas scaling back to be more palatable for investors. And I saw employees who were disillusioned because they didn't feel that the company they were in were taking the actions that they would talk about. I felt so frustrated. I knew I wanted to do something, and I didn't know what. And all of this culminated earlier this year when billionaires started having rocket measuring contests. The space race of 2021, right? For what? To say they did it. The same billionaires that put millions into sustainability promises, who talk about how tech is going to revolutionize the world, who exploit their workers, who mine hazardous materials in developing countries, who race their rockets into space to see who could do it first. I was so angry. And I was really disappointed, because this wasn't the world that I had told I would grow up in. I had been told I would grow up in. So what did I do about it? The only thing I could at that moment, which was to make some art. And then I posted it on TikTok, because that's what you do. So I made this art, and I posted it on TikTok, and it went viral. It turns out I am not the only person feeling this way. I can tell by some of the noise in the audience that there are probably people here feeling similar ways. But this went viral, and it led to people all over the world reaching out to me, saying, I feel this way too, what can we do about it? This reminded me that there was community. I was not feeling this way alone. My actions, right, as a result of my emotions, led to community. And the community that I found, once again, gave me hope. Hope is optimism with its sleeves rolled up. What does that mean? Hope is a verb to me. Optimism, the optimism I saw in the tech world, ignored the elephant in the room. which was climate change, happening now. It's not something happening in the future. We've lost species, people have lost homes, the weather has changed. It will continue to change. Things are not getting easier from here. But we have technology, we have communities, and if we have hope, we have a direction for all of that action. So all of this to say, I did leave my job in the tech world, and I was brought right back to my roots at the Green School, where I met Clover Hogan, a fellow alumni, and the founder and executive director of Force of Nature. We are a youth nonprofit mobilizing mindsets for climate action. We've worked with students in over 50 countries, thousands of young people, to learn about their emotions around climate change and to help them step up instead of shut down. These are mindset workshops, they're action workshops, and we work with companies, nonprofit leaders, and educators to center intergenerational conversations as part of the solution. When you think about hope in your lives, if you have children, you might think about your children. If you have siblings, you might think about your siblings. There is this magic when intergenerational change comes together, where those with experience and those with unbridled optimism have the opportunity to bring these things together. And so at Force of Nature, we also work with companies. One you might be familiar with is P&G. They have so many brands. You might know Head & Shoulders, or Olay, or Fairy, or Tampax. We've now worked in every section of the 97,000 person organization, in every sector. And we're now running a 10-week accelerator program with their young employees to help them realize the agency that they have in the company to make change. And we're working with their senior leaders to say, you better be listening. There's opportunity here. What we see the most in companies is senior leaders who feel like it's not possible to make change anymore. Climate champions who have always had this voice in the company feel like there's nothing they can do because no one's listening. They feel like they've pushed enough, right? You don't want to risk your job. Totally understandable. What we also see is young people in the company who enter with optimism, with drive, who feel there can be things that can change, who are then shut down by those same senior leaders who also once wanted to make a difference. So we create the dialogue. We hold space for these people, encourage workshops, facilitate discussions. And this is where the hope is, right? It's in these spaces, in these conversations, where people are able to realize that actually there are others that care too. So, with all of this and my ongoing journey, what is the message that I hope to leave you with? There is hope. It's a lot closer than you think. And all of those emotions that you feel about the climate crisis, don't let them overwhelm you. Sit with them, experience them, recognize what they're telling you, allow them to motivate you. We do actually need everyone taking imperfect action, right? And I want to finish with a little bit of data, the same way I started. My clicker's not working. Someone change the slide? Thanks. So I want to end with a little bit of data. Of the 100 most sustainable companies in the world, which are classified as publicly listed companies, there's a whole index on it, happy to share the source after the talk, 40 of those are in Europe. There is good news all around you. In fact, it might just be with you in this room today. Your community is out there, and good things are happening. You just have to be thinking about finding them. So with all of that, this brings me back to hope. And before I go there, I want to emphasize something. Eco-anxiety, eco-guilt, these feelings are normal. Imposter syndrome, that one that says, who am I to do something anyway? Who are you not to? We don't need hundreds of people taking perfect action. We need everyone taking imperfect action. And actually, if you go out and take one action, that is where the hope can flood in. Brings me back to hope and a quote from Desmond Tutu, who says, could someone click my slide, please? Which says, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all the darkness. And one more slide click, please. And to David Attenborough, famed British environmentalist, who says, we are at a unique stage in our history. Never before have we had such an awareness of what we're doing to the planet, and never before have we had the power to do something about that. Thank you very much. Now, I finished a little bit early, so we have a little bit of time for Q&A. I know it's 10:30 in the morning, but does anyone have any questions?
I sure hope so. Come on, wake up. I'll kick off. I loved it. What an inspiring way to start the day. A wake-up call in the morning. So thanks. Yeah.
You're welcome.
I have two children, 9 and 12. I get the idea of the anxiety that you're talking about. They speak to me about topics that I'm less familiar with than I should be sometimes, or things that I am familiar with that I don't want to talk to them about. And there's some research out there that says that 70%, three-quarters of the teachers on the planet feel like they're completely unprepared, or at least not equipped with what they need to teach children these days about climate change. What's being done? What can be done? What should you do?
Absolutely. Well, to start at home quickly, because that's what we can control, right? If you have young people in your life, children or adopted children or whatever it is, siblings, part of it is realizing that all the climate education you could possibly need exists online. There are some incredible resources on Aim High is one in the UK that I can think of, but incredible resources for learning about climate change. But most of the time when young people are coming to you asking those questions, they're not looking for a science lecture. They want to know, am I going to be okay?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Is the world that I'm inheriting going to be okay? Yeah. And sometimes we just have to sit with those feelings, that fear. I know you're scared about the future. I am sometimes too. Young people in our lives don't need to be told how to feel. They don't need to be made to feel better. They are incredibly intelligent, incredibly resilient, and I know you don't want to have that conversation with your 4-year-old, right? You don't want to say, I'm scared about the future, because then what faith do they have? But young people need to be supported more than ever to take action in an area that they're excited about. I had someone talk to me the other week. My daughter's only interested in clothes and her presence on Instagram. How do I get her to care about climate change? And my answer was, you don't. Ask her why she cares about those things. Encourage her to care about them more. There's a young person who I know called Cenk Oz, who founded a media company called Thread Media, who are now reaching hundreds of thousands of young people across the world and talking to them about these difficult issues around climate change, around diversity, around racism, around systemic issues that need to be shifted. And they have a whole movement of young people around the world behind them. He's 16 years old. If his mother had not asked him about his curiosity about social media, he probably wouldn't have done that, right? So encourage the young people in your lives wherever they are, and be with them in the difficult emotions and be honest about how you're feeling, because that's where the space for growth and learning comes from.
Question from the audience? Okay, audience. When was how many of you had heard of doom scrolling before COVID? Or how many of you have heard of doom scrolling in general? Anybody? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
You mentioned that in your description.
Yeah.
You had two terms which disaster porn is something that I hadn't really looked at. I think it's more just porn. But doom scrolling is definitely something I'm acutely aware of. It'd be nice for you to maybe talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Do any of you watch murder documentaries? You know, like how to find a murderer or stuff like that on Netflix? Is that just me? I love them. I'm like, my boyfriend's like, what do you want to watch on Netflix? I'm like, murder. Right? Disaster porn. When I made that art piece, I think I spent like 2 weeks scrolling through stories of families that had lost their homes in the California fires. I used to pass through one of those towns. Every time I would drive from university to see my younger brother at his university, I would drive through those towns. And so when I heard the news, I started reading about it and I couldn't stop. First-hand accounts, second-hand accounts, firefighter account. I read all of them. I looked at all the photos. Disaster porn, there's something about the way that really human disasters make us feel that kind of adrenaline, that fear. It's addicting. Because we're like, what if it happened to me? I have to know everything, right? Doom scrolling, you cannot tell me you have not sat on your phone during the pandemic and just scrolled through the news. And it's like one thing after another. Billionaires go to space. Factory crashes in India. You know, like floods cause homelessness. You're just like, oh man, it's constant. No matter where you go to get your news, it's everywhere. So that's doom scrolling. And it doesn't feel good. And I encourage you to stop doing it as much as possible. But I still do it because social media is built to be addictive, right? But those are kind of the example definitions of those two terms.
I'd encourage you all to stop doom scrolling. I'd encourage you right now to give a big round of applause to Kathleen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for kicking off the day.